Montana Territory, 1868. The vast expanse of untamed frontier stretched before Preston Calloway like an endless sea of promise and peril. As the early morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape, Preston adjusted his tan Stetson and surveyed the rolling prairie from atop his chestnut gelding. At 25, he had already seen more bloodshed and hardship than most men twice his age. The war between the states had left him with invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical wound could reach. "No point getting attached to anything out here," Preston muttered to his horse as they descended toward the winding creek below. Or anyone. He had learned that lesson the hard way, watching friends and family fall to bullets, disease, and the unforgiving elements of the frontier. The West was no place for sentimentality. A man survived by keeping his distance, staying sharp and trusting no one but himself and his horse. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that would only lead to more pain. The open range was his home now, and solitude his only reliable companion. His lean, muscular frame carried the quiet confidence of a man who had proven himself against the worst the frontier could throw at him. Despite his youth, the other ranch hands at the Diamond B respected Preston's skill with horses and cattle, his steady hand with a Colt revolver, and his uncanny ability to read the weather and terrain. His clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes belied the hardness he had cultivated within. "Let's get these cattle moved before noon," he called to the two hands riding nearby. "Storm's coming in from the north." The men nodded, knowing better than to question Preston's weather sense. They had been driving a small herd of cattle to the railhead in Fort Benton, where Preston's boss, Old Man Buchanan, had arranged a sale that would keep the ranch afloat for another season. The Diamond B wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was honest work with fair pay, everything Preston needed and nothing more. As they approached the creek crossing, a distant sound caught Preston's attention. He raised his hand, signaling the others to halt. "You hear that?" he asked, his body tensing. "Sounded like a scream," said Hank, the older of the two hands. "Female scream," added young Willie, his eyes widening beneath his hat brim. Preston's jaw tightened. Whatever was happening wasn't his business. They had cattle to move and a schedule to keep. Getting involved in other people's troubles was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. "You two stay with the herd," he said finally, his conscience warring with his better judgment. "I'll check it out." Before either man could respond, Preston urged his horse forward, following the sound across the creek and into a copse of cottonwoods. As he emerged on the other side, the scene before him sparked an immediate surge of anger. A stagecoach stood at an angle across the trail, one wheel clearly broken. Three rough-looking men surrounded a young woman who stood with her back against the coach, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear evident in her posture. The driver lay motionless on the ground nearby. "I've told you gentlemen I have nothing of value," the woman said, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "The company strongbox is empty, you can see for yourself." "Maybe we ain't just after money," growled the tallest of the men, stepping closer to her. Preston's hand moved instinctively to his revolver as he assessed the situation. 3 against 1 weren't odds he liked, but he couldn't turn away now. He urged his horse forward, emerging from the trees with deliberate noise to announce his presence. "Seems to me the lady's made her position clear," Preston called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. 3 heads snapped toward him, hands moving to weapons. The woman's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and concern crossing her delicate features. She was younger than Preston had initially thought, perhaps 20 or 21, with honey blonde hair partially escaping from beneath a modest traveling hat. Her traveling dress of deep blue cotton was dusty from the journey but well made, suggesting means without ostentation. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," said the apparent leader of the group, a bearded man with a nasty scar running through his left eyebrow. "Ride on while you still can." Preston kept his horse moving at a walk, approaching at an angle that gave him a clear view of all 3 men. "Well now, I'm afraid I can't do that. See, I've got a personal policy against leaving ladies in distress." "Then you've got a personal appointment with a grave," the scarred man replied, his hand hovering over his pistol. Preston's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened to steel. "I wouldn't recommend drawing that iron. I don't miss often." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Preston kept his breathing even, his focus absolute. He'd faced down men like this before, predators who mistook kindness for weakness. "3 against 1, said the shortest robber, a wiry man with yellowed teeth. "You ain't that good, cowboy." "Maybe not," Preston conceded, "but I'll guarantee the first man draws gets a bullet, who wants to volunteer." The woman used this moment of distraction to move slightly away from the stagecoach, giving herself more room should shooting start. The movement caught the attention of the third robber, who lunged toward her. Preston drew and fired in one fluid motion. The sound cracked across the clearing as the robber howled, clutching his shoulder where Preston's bullet had struck. In the ensuing chaos, Preston leaped from his horse, using the animal for cover as the other 2 men drew their weapons. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering wood on the stagecoach and kicking up dirt around Preston's boots. He fired twice more, catching the leader in the leg and sending the wiry man diving for cover behind a boulder. "The next shots won't be so merciful," Preston called out, his revolver trained steadily on the leader who now sat clutching his bleeding leg. "We're leaving," the scarred man shouted, his bravado evaporating as blood seeped between his fingers. "Just don't shoot no more." "Toss your guns first," Preston commanded. With reluctant curses, the robbers complied, throwing their weapons toward the center of the clearing. The wounded pair helped each other to their horses while the wiry man kept his hands visible, backing toward his own mount. "If I see any of you in this territory again, I won't aim for limbs," Preston warned as they mounted up. The trio retreated down the trail, the wounded men slumped in their saddles. Preston kept his revolver ready until they disappeared from sight, then quickly moved to check on the stage driver. The woman had already knelt beside him. "He's alive," she said, relief evident in her voice. "They struck him from behind when he refused to stop the coach." Preston holstered his weapon and knelt on the driver's other side. The man's pulse was steady, and the wound on his head looked worse than it likely was. Scalp wounds always bled profusely. "He should be fine once he wakes," Preston confirmed. "Head wounds look nastier than they are." He finally looked directly at the woman, taking in her features properly for the first time. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, set in a heart-shaped face with high cheekbones and a determined chin. Despite the ordeal she'd just endured, she maintained a composure that impressed him. Most city women he'd encountered would have been in hysterics by now. "Willow Thompson," she said, extending a delicate but surprisingly firm hand. "And I believe I owe you my life, Mr. Calloway," he replied, briefly taking her hand. "Preston Calloway, and you don't owe me anything, Miss Thompson, just happened to be passing by." "Nevertheless, your passing by was most fortuitous." A smile transformed her face, revealing a small dimple in her right cheek. "You're quite handy with that revolver, Mr. Calloway." Preston shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude, and the way her smile made something long dormant stir within him. He stood and moved toward the stagecoach to inspect the damage. "Wheels completely shattered," he observed, changing the subject. "You headed to Fort Benton." "Yes," Willow confirmed, rising gracefully to her feet. "I'm to take a position as a schoolteacher there." Preston nodded, calculating distances and options. "Fort Benton's still a good day's ride from here. I've got 2 men with a cattle herd just beyond those trees. We can jury-rig something for the coach, but it won't be quick or pretty." A groan from the driver interrupted them as the man began to regain consciousness. Preston helped him sit up slowly, offering his canteen. "Easy now," Preston cautioned as the driver, a gray-haired man named Sullivan according to Willow, took a tentative sip of water. "Those bastards," Sullivan muttered, touching his head gingerly, "hit me before I even knew they were there." "The lady." "She's fine," Preston assured him. "Robbers are gone." Sullivan looked at Preston with newfound respect. "You run them off yourself." "Mr. Calloway did more than run them off," Willow interjected. "He shot 2 of them when they wouldn't back down." The driver whistled appreciatively. "Much obliged to you, sir. Company doesn't pay me enough to die for their mail pouches." Preston stood and whistled for his horse. "I'll get my men. We'll see about fixing your wheel enough to get you to Fort Benton." As he turned to leave, Willow stepped forward. "Mr. Calloway," she called, causing him to pause, "thank you truly." Preston tipped his hat slightly, uncomfortable with her earnest gratitude. "Just doing what needed doing, Miss Thompson." As he rode back toward his waiting men and cattle, Preston tried to ignore the lingering impression of Willow Thompson's green eyes, and the way they had looked at him with such open admiration. Attachments were dangerous. Caring for someone only gave fate more ammunition to use against you. Yet as he explained the situation to Hank and Willie, he couldn't help but wonder what a schoolteacher from back east was doing out here in the Montana Territory all alone. The frontier was no place for someone so refined. "Looks like we're making a detour," he told his men, pushing thoughts of green eyes and dimpled smiles from his mind. "We've got a stagecoach to fix." By the time they'd fashioned a makeshift wheel from cottonwood and rope, the afternoon was waning. The repair wouldn't win any prizes for craftsmanship, but Preston judged it sturdy enough to reach Fort Benton if they traveled slowly. "It'll hold if you don't push faster than a walk," he explained to Sullivan, who had recovered enough to sit on the driver's bench, though his complexion remained pale. "And avoid the rocky patches when you can." The driver nodded, looking doubtfully at their handiwork. "Don't have much choice, do I? Can't leave the mail out here, and the lady needs to get to town." Preston turned to where Willow stood watching them work. Throughout the afternoon, she had proven herself surprisingly capable, fetching tools and water without complaint, even offering suggestions for strengthening the makeshift wheel that showed practical intelligence. "You'll reach town by tomorrow afternoon at this pace," Preston told her. "Should be safe enough now, but take this just in case." He offered her a small Derringer pistol from his saddlebag. "It's not much, but it'll discourage trouble at close range." Willow accepted the weapon, handling it with unexpected familiarity. "My father insisted I learn to shoot before I left Philadelphia," she explained, noting his raised eyebrow. "He said a teacher on the frontier needed more than just books and arithmetic." "Your father sounds like a sensible man," Preston replied, impressed despite himself. "He was," she said simply, a fleeting sadness crossing her features. "He passed last winter. That's partly why I accepted the teaching position out here. Too many memories back home." Preston nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. Fresh starts are worth something. A moment of connection passed between them, an unspoken recognition of shared experience that made Preston distinctly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "We've got cattle to move," he said, gesturing to where Hank and Willie waited with the herd. "Best get on our way." Sullivan climbed awkwardly onto the driver's seat, testing his balance. "We're much obliged to you, Mr. Calloway. If you're ever in Fort Benton, the stage office will stand you to a meal and a drink." Preston tipped his hat in acknowledgement, then turned to mount his horse. As he settled into the saddle, Willow approached, her hand resting lightly on his stirrup. "Will you be coming to Fort Benton soon?" she asked, those green eyes looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "When we deliver the cattle," he answered, keeping his tone neutral despite the unexpected flutter her question caused. 3, maybe 4 days. She smiled, that dimple appearing again. "Then perhaps I can repay your kindness properly. I'll be starting at the schoolhouse on Pine Street." Before Preston could formulate a response that wouldn't encourage her, Sullivan called out that they were ready to depart. With a final nod to Preston, Willow returned to the stagecoach and climbed inside. As the vehicle lumbered slowly away, the makeshift wheel holding steady, Preston felt an unfamiliar tug of regret. Shaking it off, he turned his horse toward his waiting men and the cattle beyond. "Let's move," he said brusquely. "We've lost enough daylight." Yet as they resumed their journey, Preston found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to a pair of green eyes and a soft voice that had thanked him with such genuine warmth. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him that way, as though he were something more than just another hard man in a hard country. He pushed the thoughts away. The frontier had taught him that survival meant focusing on the task at hand. Daydreaming about schoolteachers was a luxury he couldn't afford. But that night, as they camped under the vast Montana sky, Preston found himself wondering if the stagecoach had made it safely to shelter before dark. He told himself it was merely professional concern. After all, he'd invested considerable effort in that repair job. Even he wasn't entirely convinced by the lie. Fort Benton hummed with the familiar energy of a frontier river port as Preston rode down its main street 3 days later. After successfully delivering the cattle and collecting payment for Old Man Buchanan, he had sent Hank and Willie back to the ranch while he remained to purchase supplies. At least that's what he'd told them. The truth, which Preston was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that thoughts of Willow Thompson had persisted throughout their drive, becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The rational part of him insisted he was merely checking to ensure she had arrived safely. The rest of him knew it was something more. The newly constructed schoolhouse wasn't difficult to find on Pine Street. A simple clapboard building with large windows and a small bell tower, it stood as a testament to the town's growing prosperity and permanence. Preston tethered his horse at the hitching post and hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? Schoolteachers and cowboys didn't exactly move in the same circles. She had probably just been polite, grateful for his help, but not actually expecting him to call on her. As he stood debating whether to leave, the schoolhouse door opened and a stream of children poured out, their lessons apparently concluded for the day. Behind them, framed in the doorway, stood Willow Thompson. She looked different than she had on the trail, her blonde hair neatly arranged, her dress a becoming shade of lavender rather than the practical blue traveling outfit. She smiled and called out instructions to various children, her face animated and bright in the afternoon sunlight. Preston remained by his horse, watching her interaction with her students. She clearly belonged here, bringing education and refinement to this rough-edged town. He, on the other hand, belonged to the open country, the cattle trails and lonely campfires. He was about to mount his horse and ride away when she looked up and saw him. The surprise and pleasure that transformed her face made something catch in Preston's chest. "Mr. Calloway," she called, excusing herself from the last lingering children and walking toward him. "You came." Preston removed his hat, suddenly conscious of the trail dust on his clothes. "Just delivering cattle," he explained, trying to sound casual. "Thought I'd check that you arrived safely." "We did, thanks to your help," she confirmed, that dimple appearing as she smiled. "The stage company was most impressed with your improvised wheel. It held all the way to town." An awkward silence fell between them. Preston shifted his weight, acutely aware of how out of place he felt standing in front of this proper schoolhouse with this proper Eastern lady. "Well," he said finally, "glad to hear it. I should be getting on." "Have you eaten?" Willow interrupted, surprising him. "I was just about to have a late lunch. The cafe across the street makes a wonderful stew, and I would be delighted to repay your kindness with a meal." Preston hesitated, every instinct warning him to politely decline and ride away. Getting involved, even for something as innocent as a meal, was a step toward the kind of attachment he'd sworn to avoid. But something in her hopeful expression broke through his carefully constructed defenses. "I suppose I could eat," he conceded, surprising himself as much as her. The smile that illuminated her face made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Wonderful, let me just lock up the schoolhouse." As Preston waited, he silently berated himself. One meal, he promised. Just one meal to satisfy his curiosity about this woman who had occupied far too many of his thoughts lately, and then he would return to the ranch and the solitary life he had chosen. The cafe was a modest establishment but clean and welcoming. They settled at a table near the window where Preston could keep an eye on his horse, a habit ingrained by years on the frontier. "I must admit," Willow said after they had ordered, "I wasn't entirely certain you would come to Fort Benton so soon." Preston shrugged. Cattle needed delivering. "Of course," she replied. though her slight smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by his nonchalance. "And how is your ranch? Is it nearby?" "Not my ranch," Preston corrected. "I work for the Diamond Bee, about 2 days' ride southwest of here. Good outfit, fair boss." "And is that what you've always done?" "Ranch work." Preston shifted uncomfortably, unaccustomed to personal questions. "No, was a scout for the Union Army during the war. Before that, grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania." Her eyes widened slightly. "Pennsylvania. We're practically neighbors then. I'm from Philadelphia." "Western Pennsylvania," Preston clarified. "Different world from Philadelphia." Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As they ate, Willow shared stories of her journey west and her first impressions of Fort Benton. Preston found himself listening more intently than he'd intended, drawn in by her animated descriptions and perceptive observations. "The children here are remarkable," she was saying, her face lighting up with genuine passion. "They have a practical knowledge that Eastern children lack. One 8-year-old boy explained the entire process of tanning hides to me yesterday with more clarity than any textbook I've read." Preston found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "Different kind of education out here. Survival matters more than Latin." "Yes, but both have their place," Willow insisted. "These children deserve the chance to choose their future, whether that's continuing the frontier traditions of their parents or pursuing other paths. Education gives them that choice." Her conviction was compelling, and Preston realized with some surprise that their conversation had extended well beyond the time it took to finish their meal. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows through the cafe windows. "I should get going," he said reluctantly. "Got supplies to collect before the mercantile closes." Disappointment flickered across her face, but she nodded. "Of course, thank you for checking on me, Mr. Calloway." "Preston," he corrected, the word escaping before he could consider it. Her smile returned. "Preston, and you must call me Willow." As they stepped out onto the boardwalk, an uncomfortable awareness settled over Preston. He had enjoyed their conversation far more than he should have. Worse, he found himself wanting to continue it, to learn more about this woman who combined Eastern refinement with surprising frontier practicality. "Will you be returning to Fort Benton soon?" Willow asked as they reached his horse. The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities Preston had long ago decided to avoid. The sensible answer was no. The Diamond Bee rarely had business in Fort Benton more than a few times a year. "Not sure," he answered honestly. "Ranch work doesn't bring me this way often." She nodded, accepting his answer without pressing. "Well, if you do return, you know where to find me. The schoolhouse door is always open during daylight hours." Preston mounted his horse, tipping his hat to her. "Safe teaching, Willow Thompson." She smiled up at him, shielding her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "Safe trails, Preston Calloway." As he rode out of town, supplies secured and business concluded, Preston tried to convince himself that the odd lightness he felt was simply relief at completing his tasks efficiently. It certainly had nothing to do with green eyes, a dimpled smile, or conversation that had flowed more easily than any he could remember in years. The Montana twilight settled around him as he made camp several miles outside of town. Alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire, Preston found himself remembering details of their conversation. The way her eyes had sparkled when discussing her students, the thoughtful tilt of her head when listening to his brief answers, the unexpected moments when her observations had made him laugh despite himself. Just one meal, he reminded himself aloud, his voice stark in the gathering darkness. Just curiosity satisfied. But as he settled into his bedroll beneath the vast canopy of stars, Preston knew he was lying to himself. Something had awakened in him today, something he had believed long dead after the war and years of frontier hardship. Something dangerous. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on the familiar sounds of the night, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of wind through prairie grass, the occasional shifting of his horse. Yet even as sleep finally claimed him, it was Willow Thompson's voice that echoed in his dreams. The summer months passed with the familiar rhythm of ranch work, cattle to move, fences to mend, horses to break. Preston threw himself into the physical labor with even more determination than usual, as if the exertion could drive thoughts of a certain schoolteacher from his mind. It wasn't entirely successful. In quiet moments during night watches or long rides across the prairie, Preston found his thoughts drifting to Fort Benton and the schoolhouse on Pine Street. Several times, he nearly convinced himself to make the journey into town for some fabricated reason, only to change his mind at the last moment. What would be the point? Willow Thompson represented everything he had learned to avoid: connection, attachment, the vulnerability that came with letting someone matter. The frontier had taught him harshly that such things only led to pain in this unforgiving land. Yet when Old Man Buchanan announced the need to deliver a small herd of horses to Fort Benton in late August, Preston volunteered before he could talk himself out of it. "Thought you preferred cattle work," Buchanan commented, his weathered face creasing in mild surprise. Preston shrugged. "Change of scenery doesn't hurt." The older man studied him for a moment, his shrewd eyes missing little. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that schoolteacher you helped back in May, would it?" Heat rose in Preston's face despite his best efforts. "Just volunteering for a job that needs doing." Buchanan chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "Take Willie with you. Boy needs the experience, and those horses can be a handful." The journey to Fort Benton took 3 days with the small herd of 8 horses, quality stock that Buchanan had bred specifically for the Army outpost there. Preston was grateful for the demands of the trail, which left little time for contemplating what he would say when he reached town. Or if he would say anything at all. Perhaps it would be wiser to complete the business transaction and leave without seeking out Willow Thompson. After all, nearly 3 months had passed. She had likely forgotten him entirely. Fort Benton appeared much as it had in May, though the August heat had dried the streets to a fine dust that rose in clouds around the horses' hooves as they rode in. After delivering the animals to the fort and collecting payment, Preston sent Willie to replenish their supplies. "Meet me at the livery in 2 hours," he instructed the younger man. "We'll head back before evening." Willie nodded, his expression curious but respectful enough not to question Preston's plans for those 2 hours. As the young hand headed toward the mercantile, Preston stood for a long moment in the middle of the busy street, indecision weighing on him. The sensible choice was clear: have a drink at the saloon, rest his trail-weary body for an hour, and then ride out with Willie as planned. Instead, Preston found himself walking toward Pine Street, dust rising with each step. The schoolhouse looked much as it had before, though someone had added flower boxes beneath the windows, splashes of color against the weathered wood. As Preston approached, he could hear the sound of young voices reciting something in unison. He paused at the base of the steps, suddenly unsure. What was he doing here? She was in the middle of teaching. He was trail-worn and dusty. This was foolishness of the highest order. Preston had turned to leave when the schoolhouse door opened, and a stream of children emerged, talking excitedly among themselves. A quick glance at the position of the sun told him it must be the midday recess. The children parted around him like water around a stone, a few of the boys eyeing his worn Colt revolver with undisguised interest. And then, framed in the doorway just as she had been months before, stood Willow Thompson. She wore a dress of pale yellow today, her honey-blonde hair pinned up in a style that somehow managed to be both practical and becoming. When she spotted him standing at the base of the steps, her expression transformed from polite schoolteacher decorum to genuine surprise and pleasure. "Preston Calloway," she said, coming down the steps toward him. "You've returned to Fort Benton." He removed his hat, suddenly acutely aware of his trail dust and 3-day stubble. "Horse delivery to the fort," he explained. "Thought I might check if the schoolhouse was still standing." Her smile widened, that dimple appearing in her right cheek. "As you can see, it remains upright despite the best efforts of 28 energetic pupils." She gestured to the milling children in the small yard beside the building. Preston nodded, words suddenly failing him now that he stood before her. What had he planned to say? He couldn't remember if he'd ever known at all. Willow seemed to sense his discomfort. The "The children have a half-hour recess," she said. "Would you care to sit for a few minutes? I usually take my lunch on the bench beneath that cottonwood." She pointed to a simple wooden bench positioned in the shade of a large tree at the edge of the schoolyard, offering a view of both the playing children and the distant curve of the Missouri River beyond the town. "Don't want to interrupt your meal," Preston demurred. "Nonsense," she replied with a firmness that reminded him she commanded a classroom of frontier children daily. "I insist. You can tell me what you've been doing these past months." Before he could formulate another objection, Willow had retrieved a small basket from inside the schoolhouse and was leading the way to the bench. Preston followed, feeling strangely out of place among the shouts and laughter of playing children, yet drawn forward by the graceful figure walking ahead of him. The bench provided welcome shade from the August sun. As they sat, Willow opened her basket and offered him half of her sandwich. "It's nothing fancy, just ham and bread, but you're welcome to share." Preston started to refuse, then realized he was indeed hungry after the morning's work. "Thank you," he said, accepting the offered food. They ate in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the children play an improvised game of tag around the schoolyard. Preston found the simple domesticity of the moment both foreign and oddly comforting. "How have you been, Preston?" Willow asked finally, her green eyes studying him with genuine interest. "Fine," he answered automatically, then felt the inadequacy of the response. "Ranch keeps busy in summer. Cattle need moving, horses need breaking. Weather's been good." She smiled at his terse report. "And have you rescued any more stagecoaches since May?" "None that crossed my path," he replied, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as her teasing broke the ice. "Town treating you well?" "Very well," she confirmed, her expression brightening. "The children are wonderful, eager to learn despite having so many other responsibilities at home, and the townspeople have been most welcoming. I've even started an evening class for adults who wish to improve their reading." Preston nodded, unsurprised that she had already become an integral part of the community. Willow Thompson possessed a warmth and genuine interest in others that naturally drew people to her, himself included, despite his best efforts. "The school seems to be flourishing," he observed, glancing toward the solid building. "Those flower boxes are new." "My additions," she admitted. "A small touch of beauty makes learning more inviting, I think. The children help tend them as part of their natural science lessons." Preston found himself smiling at her practical approach. "Clever way to teach responsibility." "Thank you," she replied, looking pleased at his understanding. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I wasn't certain I would see you again." The simple statement held a question that hung between them, one that Preston wasn't sure how to answer. Why had he come? What did he want from this woman whose life was so different from his own? "Wasn't certain myself," he admitted finally, opting for honesty. "Ranch work doesn't often bring me this way." "Yet here you are," she observed quietly. "Here I am," he agreed, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, or a possibility neither was quite ready to name. Preston felt his carefully maintained distance wavering under the warmth of her regard. A bell rang from the schoolhouse porch, breaking the moment. Willow glanced toward the sound with a small sigh. "That's the end of recess," she explained, gathering the remnants of her lunch. "I must return to my pupils." Preston stood, settling his hat back on his head. "And I should find my ranch hand." "We're heading back this afternoon." Disappointment flickered across her features, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Of course, it was good to see you again, Preston." He nodded, searching for the right words, and finding none that seemed adequate. As she turned to leave, something impulsive and entirely uncharacteristic rose within him. "Willow," he called, causing her to pause and look back. "I'll be returning in September. Buchanan needs more supplies than we can carry today." It wasn't entirely a lie. The ranch would need additional supplies before winter, but Preston knew he could have sent Willie or another hand for them. The smile that bloomed across her face made the half-truth worth it. "I'll be here," she said simply. As Preston walked back toward the center of town, he tried to make sense of the conflict raging within him. He had spent years cultivating distance, protecting himself from the pain that came with caring too deeply in a land where death and loss were constant companions. Yet here he was, already calculating how soon he could reasonably return to Fort Benton. "You're a fool, Calloway," he muttered to himself as he approached the livery where Willie waited with their horses. "A damned fool." But for the first time in years, he wasn't certain that was entirely a bad thing. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn to the Montana Territory. True to his word, Preston returned to Fort Benton, this time alone with a wagon for the promised supplies. If Old Man Buchanan suspected the timing of the supply run had more to do with a certain schoolteacher than actual ranch needs, he kept his observations to himself. Preston's visits to Fort Benton became a regular occurrence through the fall months, sometimes with legitimate ranch business, sometimes with reasons that grew increasingly thin. Each time he found himself at the schoolhouse on Pine Street, where Willow always greeted him with genuine pleasure. Their friendship, for Preston refused to name it anything else, even in his private thoughts, developed through these brief encounters. Sometimes they shared a meal at the cafe, sometimes just conversation on the bench beneath the cottonwood. Willow told him of her teaching challenges and small triumphs. Preston, to his own surprise, found himself sharing more of his own past than he had with anyone in years. He told her about his Pennsylvania childhood, his difficult decision to join the Union Army despite his family's divided loyalties, the friends he had lost during the war. She listened without judgment, offering neither pity nor platitudes, simply understanding. In turn, she shared her own stories, her father's career as a doctor, her mother's death from influenza when Willow was 16, her determination to forge her own path rather than marry one of Philadelphia's eligible bachelors as her aunts had urged. "They meant well," she explained during one October visit as they walked along the river path. "But after nursing my father through his final illness, I couldn't bear the thought of simply becoming someone's wife without having first lived my own life. Teaching offered me independence and purpose." "Brave choice," Preston observed, "especially coming all the way out here alone." Willow smiled, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. "Perhaps. Though I suspect it takes more courage to face what you've faced. War, the daily dangers of the frontier." Preston shook his head. "Different kind of courage. Facing a gun is straightforward. What you did, leaving everything familiar behind, that's harder in some ways." She studied him thoughtfully. "You did the same, didn't you, after the war, left Pennsylvania behind?" "Couldn't go back," he admitted quietly. "Too much had changed, I had changed." Understanding passed between them, the recognition of two people who had chosen to remake their lives far from where they began, each seeking something they couldn't quite name. As November approached, bringing the threat of early winter storms, Preston knew his regular visits would soon become impossible. The mountain passes between the Diamond B and Fort Benton would be treacherous until spring, limiting travel to only the most essential journeys. On what he knew would likely be his last visit until winter's grip loosened, Preston arrived at the schoolhouse just as Willow was dismissing her students for the day. The children had grown accustomed to his occasional presence and greeted him with the casual acceptance of youth. "Mr. Calloway," called one of the older boys as he passed, "did you bring your lasso today?" During a previous visit, Preston had demonstrated basic roping techniques as part of a special presentation on ranch life that Willow had arranged for her students. The children had been fascinated, particularly the boys. "Not today, Jimmy," Preston replied. "Just stopped by to speak with Miss Thompson." The boy nodded, clearly disappointed but resilient in the way of frontier children. "Next time then," he said before running to catch up with his friends. Willow approached, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders against the November chill. "They've been asking when you would return," she said with a smile. "I think you've inspired several future cowboys." Preston felt an unaccustomed warmth at her words. The idea that these children looked forward to his visits, that he had somehow become a small part of their education, was strangely satisfying. "Wanted to let you know I won't be making it back to town for a while," he said, getting to the purpose of his visit. "Winter's coming early this year, can smell it in the air." Disappointment crossed Willow's face, though she quickly composed herself. "Of course, I understand the passes become dangerous." "Impassable," Preston corrected, "at least until March, maybe April depending on the snowfall." She nodded, absorbing this information. "Then I suppose this is goodbye until spring." "Looks that way," Preston agreed, feeling an unexpected hollowness at the thought of months without seeing her. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling the few remaining leaves on the cottonwood tree beside the schoolhouse. "Would you care to join me for dinner?" Willow asked suddenly. "Not at the cafe. I have a small apartment above the milliner's shop. It's modest, but I could cook something." The invitation surprised Preston. They had never met anywhere but in public places: the schoolhouse, the cafe, the river path. Something about entering her private space seemed significant in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for. Yet the thought of returning to the ranch without a proper goodbye after these months of growing friendship seemed equally wrong. "I'd like that," he heard himself say, "if you're sure it's no trouble." Her smile was answer enough. "No trouble at all, shall we say 6 o'clock? The shop is on Market Street, the blue building with white trim." Preston nodded, tipping his hat. "I'll be there." The hours until their dinner seemed to stretch endlessly. Preston completed his business in town with methodical efficiency, then found himself with time to spare and an unfamiliar nervousness settling in his stomach. On impulse, he stopped at the general store and purchased a small gift, a leather-bound journal with clean, unmarked pages. It seemed an appropriate token for a teacher, neither too personal nor too impersonal. At precisely 6 o'clock, Preston stood before the blue-painted building on Market Street, the wrapped journal tucked inside his coat. He had made an effort with his appearance, visiting the barber for a proper shave and wearing his newest shirt, a concession to the occasion that he tried not to examine too closely. Willow's apartment was accessed by an exterior staircase at the side of the building. Preston climbed the steps and knocked, adjusting his hat nervously as he waited. When the door opened, he momentarily lost his carefully prepared greeting. Willow stood framed in the doorway, illuminated by the warm light behind her. She had changed from her usual teaching attire into a dress of deep forest green that complemented her eyes. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged more simply than during school hours, with soft tendrils framing her face. "Preston," she said warmly, "please come in." The apartment was indeed modest, a single main room serving as both kitchen and living area, with what appeared to be a small bedroom visible through a partially open door. Yet Willow had transformed the simple space into something unmistakably homelike. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes both practical and literary. Cheerful curtains framed the windows, and a small vase of late-season wildflowers brightened the table set for two. "It's not much," she said, watching his reaction, "but it suits my needs." "It's nice," Preston replied honestly. "Reminds me of my mother's kitchen back in Pennsylvania. She always had flowers too, even in winter." Willow smiled, pleased by the comparison. "Please make yourself comfortable. Dinner is almost ready." As she turned to tend to something cooking on the small stove, Preston reached inside his coat and withdrew the wrapped journal. "Brought you something," he said, feeling suddenly awkward. "Just a small token for the winter." Surprise and pleasure lit Willow's features as she accepted the package. "You didn't need to bring anything," she protested gently, even as her fingers worked at the simple wrapping. When the journal emerged, she ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover with obvious appreciation. "Preston, it's lovely," she said, looking up at him with genuine delight. "Thank you. I've been using scraps of paper to record my observations of frontier education. This will be perfect for organizing my thoughts." The simple joy in her expression made something twist pleasantly in Preston's chest. "Figured a teacher could always use paper," he said, downplaying the gesture. "Glad you like it." Dinner proved to be a simple but delicious stew, accompanied by fresh bread from the town bakery. As they ate, conversation flowed as easily as it always did between them, covering Willow's plans for her students' Christmas pageant and Preston's preparations for wintering cattle at the ranch. Diamond B lost nearly 30 head in last year's February blizzard, Preston explained. Buchanan's determined not to repeat that mistake. We've been reinforcing the northern shelter belts and stockpiling extra feed. It sounds demanding work, Willow observed, refilling his coffee cup. Necessary work, Preston corrected. Cattle are the ranch's livelihood. Losing them means losing everything out here. Willow nodded thoughtfully. Not unlike teaching. If I fail to properly educate these children, I've failed not only them but the entire community's future. Preston looked at her with new appreciation. Never thought of it that way. You're right, different responsibilities, same stakes. As the evening progressed, Preston found himself increasingly reluctant to leave. This warm room with its books and flowers and Willow's engaging conversation had become more appealing than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to something beyond the daily demands of frontier survival. When the mantel clock chimed 9, reality intruded on the pleasant evening. I should go, Preston said reluctantly. Got an early start tomorrow, long ride back to the ranch. Willow nodded, though he thought he detected a similar reluctance in her expression. Of course, thank you for coming, Preston. It's been a lovely evening. They stood at the door, the moment of parting suddenly awkward after hours of comfortable conversation. Preston was acutely aware that this goodbye would need to last them through the long winter months ahead. Take care of yourself, Willow, he said finally, settling his hat on his head. Winter can be harsh out here. I will, she promised. The townspeople have been very helpful in preparing me for my first frontier winter. Mrs. Hollister from the Mercantile has practically buried me in woolen stockings and flannel sheets. Preston smiled at the image. Smart woman. Another moment of silence stretched between them, filled with things neither quite knew how to express. Preston, Willow said softly, taking a small step toward him. I want you to know how much your friendship has meant to me these past months. Coming west was lonelier than I anticipated, despite the community's kindness. The vulnerability in her admission touched something deep within him. Reckon I understand that, he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Frontier's good at making a person feel alone, even surrounded by others. She nodded, her eyes holding his. Precisely, but when you're here I don't feel that way. Preston swallowed hard, fighting the impulse to reach for her. Feel the same, he admitted, the words barely audible. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension both welcome and terrifying. Willow's gaze dropped briefly to his lips, then back to his eyes, a question in her expression that Preston both yearned to answer and feared to acknowledge. Instead, he stepped back slightly, tipping his hat. I'll return in spring, he promised. First chance I get when the pass is clear. Disappointment flickered across her features, but she smiled bravely. I'll hold you to that promise, Preston Calloway. As he descended the stairs into the cold November night, Preston felt torn between relief and regret. He had nearly crossed a line that would have irrevocably changed their friendship. Yet as he mounted his horse for the long ride back to the Diamond B, he couldn't help wondering if that change might have been worth the risk. The winter stretched before him, long months of hard work and isolation, with only memories of Willow's smile to warm the coldest days. The winter of 1868-1869 proved to be one of the harshest in recent memory. Snow piled high across the Montana Territory, blocking mountain passes and isolating ranches for weeks at a time. At the Diamond B, Preston and the other hands worked from dawn until dusk, simply keeping the cattle alive, breaking ice on water holes, distributing precious hay, and rescuing animals that strayed into snowdrifts. Physical exhaustion should have left Preston little time for reflection, yet thoughts of Willow Thompson persistently invaded his quiet moments. During long night watches in the barn or brief respites by the bunkhouse fire, he found himself remembering the warmth of her small apartment, the animation in her face as she discussed her students, the unspoken question in her eyes as they had parted. He told himself repeatedly that his fixation was merely a product of winter isolation. Any human connection would seem magnified during these months of confinement. Yet deep down, Preston knew it was more than that. Somehow, without his permission or intention, Willow had breached the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself after the war. By March, when the first tentative signs of spring began to appear, Preston had reached a decision. He would return to Fort Benton as he had promised, but this time with clarity about his intentions. Either he would pursue what was growing between them, with all the vulnerability that entailed, or he would end their acquaintance entirely. This half-state of friendship tinged with unacknowledged attraction was becoming untenable. When the passes finally cleared in early April, Preston approached Old Man Buchanan with a request for leave. "Need a few days in Fort Benton," he explained, trying to sound casual. "Personal business." Buchanan studied him with shrewd eyes. That personal business wouldn't happen to be about 5'4" with blonde hair, would it? Preston felt heat rise in his face, but met his employer's gaze directly. "My time's my own when I'm not working, sir." The older man chuckled. "Indeed it is, Calloway, take a week. Ranch can spare you now that the worst of winter's behind us." "Appreciate it," Preston replied, surprised by the generous allowance. Buchanan's expression softened slightly. "Been watching you these past months, Preston. Seen how you throw yourself into work like a man running from something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "War leaves marks on a man, some visible, some not. But isolation isn't the answer, son. Took me losing my Martha to figure that out, and by then it was too late." Preston stood uncomfortably under this unexpected insight from his normally taciturn boss. "Just going to town, Mr. Buchanan." "Of course you are," the older man agreed with a knowing smile. "Just remember, second chances don't come along often in this life, especially out here." With those words echoing in his mind, Preston departed for Fort Benton the following morning. The journey was slower than usual, spring thaw having turned the trail to mud in several places. But by late afternoon of the second day, the town came into view along the Missouri River. Preston's first impulse was to ride directly to the schoolhouse, but caution prevailed. He was trail-worn and dusty after 2 days of hard riding. Better to secure lodging, clean up, and approach Willow properly. This visit was too important for haste. After stabling his horse and taking a room at the modest hotel, Preston availed himself of a proper bath and change of clothes. The face that looked back at him from the small mirror seemed different somehow, the same features, but perhaps less guarded than the man who had ridden away from Fort Benton in November. The following morning, Preston timed his arrival at the schoolhouse to coincide with the midday recess, when Willow would have a brief respite from her teaching duties. As he approached the familiar building, he noted with pleasure that the flower boxes had been freshly planted with early spring blooms. Children spilled from the schoolhouse doors at the stroke of noon, their exuberance suggesting that spring fever affected students everywhere, even on the frontier. Several recognized Preston and called out greetings, which he acknowledged with a nod and smile. He had expected Willow to emerge as she usually did to supervise the recess, but minutes passed and the schoolhouse door remained closed. Concern growing, Preston approached one of the older girls who seemed to be keeping an eye on the younger children. "Miss Thompson inside?" he asked. The girl Sarah, if he recalled correctly from his previous visits, shook her head. "Miss Thompson's been ill, Mr. Calloway. Mrs. Hollister from the Mercantile has been teaching us this week." A prickle of alarm ran through Preston. "Ill? Seriously ill?" "Don't rightly know, sir," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Hollister just said Miss Thompson needed rest and shouldn't be disturbed." She hesitated, then added, "But I heard Mrs. Hollister telling Mr. Jenkins it was influenza. My ma says that can be real bad for grown-ups." Preston thanked the girl, his mind racing. Influenza in frontier communities could indeed be dangerous, sometimes fatal, especially after the hardships of winter when bodies were weakened from months of cold and limited fresh food. Without further deliberation, he headed toward Market Street and the blue building with white trim where Willow kept her apartment. As he approached, he noticed the curtains drawn despite the beautiful spring day, another concerning sign. Preston took the exterior stairs two at a time and knocked firmly on the door. No answer came. He knocked again, louder. "Willow," he called, "it's Preston Calloway." After a moment he heard movement inside, then a voice, Willow's but weakened and rough. "Preston." "Yes," he confirmed. "Heard you were ill, come to check on you." The door opened slowly to reveal Willow, and Preston's concern immediately deepened. She was pale, with dark circles beneath her eyes and a flush of fever on her cheeks. Her normally neat hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and she wore what appeared to be a dressing gown over a nightdress, clutching it closed at her throat. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's influenza, contagious." "Had influenza during the war," Preston replied, stepping forward gently but firmly. "Not likely to catch it again." "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped back, too weak to argue further. The apartment was dim with the curtains drawn, and Preston could see signs of neglect that were entirely uncharacteristic of Willow's usual neatness. Dishes in the small sink, a blanket crumpled on the floor where it had apparently fallen from her lap. "How long have you been ill?" he asked, guiding her to a chair. "4 days," she answered, sinking gratefully into the seat. "Mrs. Hollister brings food and checks on me, but she has the store to run and her own family." Her voice trailed off, and Preston could see how the effort of speaking taxed her strength. Without asking permission, he moved to the small kitchen area and put the kettle on the stove, then gathered the scattered dishes and began washing them. "What are you doing?" Willow asked, watching him with fever-bright eyes. "Taking care of things," he replied simply. "You need rest, clean surroundings, and proper food." "You came to Fort Benton to wash dishes?" she asked, a ghost of her usual humor surfacing despite her illness. Preston smiled slightly. "Came to see you. Finding you ill just changes the nature of the visit." Once the immediate disorder was addressed, Preston prepared tea and coaxed Willow to drink it along with some broth. Mrs. Hollister had apparently left earlier. When she had finished, he insisted she return to bed. "I'll stay in the main room," he assured her, seeing her hesitation. "Just want to make sure you have what you need." Too exhausted to protest further, Willow allowed him to help her to the bedroom door. She paused there, looking up at him with an expression that combined gratitude, confusion, and something deeper that made Preston's heart beat faster despite the circumstances. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Preston considered various responses, duty, friendship, common decency, but found himself answering with a simple truth instead. "Because I couldn't bear to ride away knowing you were in need." Something shifted in her gaze, a recognition that transcended her illness and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hand briefly before disappearing into her bedroom. For the next 3 days, Preston divided his time between caring for Willow and making brief trips to the mercantile for supplies. Mrs. Hollister, a practical frontier woman with a kind heart, expressed both surprise and approval at his presence. "She's a fine young woman, that Miss Thompson," the older woman confided as she helped Preston select appropriate foods for someone recovering from influenza. "Too independent for her own good sometimes, but this town's lucky to have her. Needs someone looking after her, though, especially out here where family's so far away." Preston made no response to this obvious hint, but inwardly he acknowledged the truth in the woman's words. The frontier was unforgiving to those who faced it alone, something he had learned through bitter experience and had been trying to forget through self-imposed isolation. Willow's fever broke on the second night of Preston's vigil. He had been dozing in a chair near the stove when her call woke him. Rushing to her bedroom door, he found her sitting up in bed, her nightdress damp with sweat but her eyes clear for the first time in days. "The fever's broken," she said, obvious relief in her voice. "I feel weak as a kitten, but the worst has passed." Preston sagged against the doorframe, only then realizing how genuinely afraid he had been. "Thank God," he murmured. Willow studied his face in the lamplight. "You look exhausted. Have you slept at all?" "Enough," he assured her. "Need anything, water, another blanket?" She shook her head, still watching him with that penetrating gaze that always made Preston feel she could see beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "Just knowing you're here is enough," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," he replied gruffly, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "Try to rest more, recovery takes time." As he turned to leave, Willow's voice stopped him. "Preston," she called softly, "why did you really come back to Fort Benton?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Preston knew he could deflect it with a casual response about ranch business or supply needs. But standing there in the dim light, with the woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness looking at him with honest inquiry, he found he no longer wanted to hide behind such pretenses. "Came for you, Willow," he admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. "To see if what I've been feeling these past months is something you might feel too." In the silence that followed his declaration, Preston could hear his own heartbeat, loud and rapid in his ears. He had faced armed men with less trepidation than he felt in this quiet moment. "And what have you been feeling?" Willow asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Preston drew a deep breath. "That you've become important to me. More important than I intended or expected. That when I'm with you, the world seems less harsh. That I think about you even when I should be thinking about cattle or fences or 100 other things." A smile slowly spread across Willow's face, transforming her tired features. "Then I'm very glad you came back," she said simply. "Because I've been feeling much the same way." The admission filled Preston with a warmth unlike anything he had experienced before. Not the heat of physical attraction, though that existed too, but something deeper, a sense of homecoming he had not felt since before the war upended his world. "We should talk about this when you're stronger," he said, reluctant to leave yet knowing she needed rest. "Plenty of time now." Willow nodded, her eyes already growing heavy again. "Promise you'll still be here when I wake." "Promise," Preston replied, meaning it more completely than any word he had ever spoken. As April bloomed into May, Willow regained her strength and returned to her teaching duties. Preston extended his stay in Fort Benton, sending word to the Diamond B that he required additional time. Old Man Buchanan's reply was succinct but telling: "Take what time you need. Some things matter more than cattle." With Willow's recovery came the conversations they had postponed, honest discussions about their feelings, their pasts, and the possibility of a future together. They walked along the river path in the gentle spring evenings, sat beneath the now leafy cottonwood tree beside the schoolhouse, and shared simple meals in Willow's apartment, no longer constrained by the boundaries of mere friendship. "I never expected to find someone like you in Montana territory," Willow confessed one evening as they sat on a bluff overlooking the Missouri, the setting sun painting the water with gold and crimson. "When I came west, I thought I was choosing independence over companionship. And I thought I was choosing survival over happiness," Preston replied, his hand finding hers in the growing twilight. "Turns out neither of us was entirely right." Willow leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural between them. "What happens now, Preston? You have your life at the ranch, and I have my students here." It was a question Preston had been considering deeply. His time in Fort Benton had shown him that the connection he shared with Willow wasn't something he was willing to relinquish. Yet practical considerations remained: his work, her teaching position, the realities of frontier life. "Been thinking about that," he admitted. "Talked to Jenkins at the land office yesterday. There's a small ranch coming available just outside town. Previous owners heading back east needs to sell. It's not much, 100 acres, small cabin, some decent grazing land. But it could be a start." Willow sat up straight, searching his face in the fading light. "Preston, are you saying?" "Saying I want to build something here," he continued, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "Something permanent. With you if you'll have me." "You would leave the Diamond B?" she asked, clearly understanding the significance of such a change. "Your position there?" Preston nodded. "Ranch work isn't scarce in Montana. Could hire out for additional income while building up my own place. be close enough to town for you to continue teaching. The practical considerations mattered, but they weren't what had driven his decision. The past weeks had shown Preston what he had been denying for months, that Willow Thompson had become essential to his happiness in a way he had never believed possible after the war. "Are you certain?" Willow asked, her voice gentle. "This is a significant change, Preston. I wouldn't want you to regret it." In answer, Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the last rays of the setting sun. A simple gold ring, not ornate or expensive, but solid and real, like the feelings that had grown between them. "Only regret I have is waiting so long to admit what you mean to me," he said, holding the ring between them. "Willow Thompson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Building a life together right here in this territory that's somehow become home to both of us." Tears glistened in Willow's green eyes, catching the golden light of sunset. "Yes," she whispered, her smile radiant despite the tears. "Yes, Preston Calloway, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Preston felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. The false belief that had guided him since the war, that isolation was the only safe path in an unforgiving world, gave way to a new truth. Love wasn't a weakness on the frontier. It was the strength that made the hardships bearable, the foundation upon which a meaningful life could be built. When he kissed her there on the bluff above the Missouri, with the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Preston finally understood the title of his own story. He had indeed saved Willow from danger that day beside the stagecoach. But in opening his heart to her, in daring to care deeply again despite the risks, she had ultimately saved him from the prison of his own making. The frontier remained what it had always been, beautiful, challenging, sometimes dangerous. But facing it together, they had found something neither had expected to discover in the wilds of Montana territory. A love strong enough to tame even the wildest heart.